Okay, I think we're going to get started. Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Sarah Biber and I lead the Surgical Innovation Program at OHSU. We are excited to have the opportunity to bring all of you together today for our investor panel and networking event. This all started at the OHSU Invent-a-thon last October, which brought together more than 500 people worldwide for a 48-hour virtual hackathon focused on tackling pressing healthcare challenges. Over half of the 4 teams that launched out of that weekend are still going strong and busily preparing for our post-hack event on April 21st. At the post-hack, these teams will have a chance to return to the virtual stage to compete for additional funding and investor support. This event is open to anyone, and we welcome you to join us to hear about the progress of these rising stars. You can register for free at inventathon.org. So these teams are motivated to build innovative med tech and digital health solutions, but many have little to no experience with investors. We put together this panel today so they could hear directly from the sorts of people they'll soon be pitching to. With such a great group of experts, we decided to open the event to the broader community. So I want to extend an equal welcome to both October's Invent-a-thon participants and all of you joining us for the first time today. I also want to give a special thanks to all the members of the Invent-a-thon team and to our partners at the Oregon Bioscience Association and Oregon Clinical and Translational Research Institute for helping bring this event to life. Don't forget that we have a fun networking session planned for directly after this panel in spatial chat. We'll be sharing the link to the networking session in the chat when it's time. We'd also love to learn more about you, our participants. In a moment, you'll see a poll in the chat and we'll be sharing your answers later. Now, I want to introduce you to our moderator, David Freeman, the Science Bureau Chief at the Wall Street Journal. David Freeman comes to the Wall Street Journal after serving as science editor at CBS News, HuffPost, and most recently, NBC News. A native of Arkansas and a Yale graduate, David has also freelanced extensively on science and health topics for news outlets ranging from Reuters to WebMD and Consumer Reports. He and his wife have 2 sons and live in New York City. David, passing it off to you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks very much. Welcome, everyone. The goal of the panel today is to help inform entrepreneurs in the health tech space how, when, and why to approach the investor community. I'm happy to be here with 6 members, 6 investors who have agreed to share what they look for when evaluating digital health, med tech, and life science companies. Our discussion will last 1 hour and 15 minutes. Immediately afterward, as Sarah mentioned, there'll be a networking session in spatial chat, which is a virtual environment where you can mingle with the panelists, other budding innovators and entrepreneurs, investors, and innovation facilitators. The link will be shared in the chat toward the end of this panel discussion. Before we meet our panelists, let me say that we welcome questions from the audience. Please put them in the chat and we'll tee them up for the panelists and mix them in with questions some of you voted up ahead of time. Before we get started, let's have a quick round of applause to thank the panelists, the virtual applause for taking the time to join us today. So thank you, everybody. And I'm going to ask each of the panelists to take 2 or 3 minutes to share more about their background and what they're up to. Let's start with Angela Jackson, who is co-founder and managing director of Portland Seed Fund. Angela, could you please tell us about your firm and your role there? What stage and types of healthcare technologies do you invest in?
Thank you, David, and thanks everybody. This is a great crowd. Very happy to be here. I am the co-founder, managing director, and general partner. These are all kind of investor-y words, fund words, of Portland Seed Fund. And if you live in Oregon, you've probably heard of us. We have invested for about 10 years in a sector agnostic fashion in our most promising startups, in not just in Oregon, but sometimes up and down the West Coast. So today we have a portfolio of over 130 companies, and probably a good, I would say 20% of that is in something adjacent to health. We invest at the seed stage or even pre-seed. A lot of times we are the first money after grants, friends, and family. We love working with bright entrepreneurs who are seeing things that we don't see yet. Sometimes we have to help them build a bridge till they're ready to, shout it out loud from the mountaintop and get the capital to scale it. But thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, we'll get into some of that in a few minutes, but thank you very much. Nice to have you. Thanks for joining. Next is Nilay Takar, who is Senior Associate at Arch Venture Partners. The same question for you, Nilay. Tell us about your firm and your investment approach, please.
Sure. Thanks, David. I'm Nilay Takar. I work for Arch Venture Partners. We've been around for about 35 odd years now, primarily focused on all things life sciences. About 80% of our portfolio is in therapeutics and 20% or so in R&D tools and instrumentation from an academic research point of view. I think the focus pretty much remains the same. We like to invest seed, Series A stage, and like to be the first institutional capital into a technology and take it all the way through to the clinic. In most cases, or if it's an R&D tool instrumentation kind of angle, then all the way to the market. I think a key focus is that we build most of the companies in our portfolio from scratch on our own and syndicate from the start. So there's rare occasions when someone comes with a pre-made pitch, if you will. And a lot of times we like to build a market thesis, find a need, and go find the best academics that are doing really cool science in a given and solving a given problem.
Okay, thanks very much. Next up is Stan Hanks, who is a general partner from Aventurine. Can you tell us about your background in your firm and your investment approach?
Sure. My background is I started in computer science, computational biology, high performance computation networking. So I'm faculty at Baylor College of Medicine for a couple of years. I've been involved in a number of biotech startups. At Aventurine, we're not your typical venture capital investor. Our money functions the same as venture capital, but what we actually invest in is intellectual property. So we're keenly interested in foundational innovations that are going to be the basis for the future, basically. And we invest in that primarily, and we assist inventors in putting together the world-class teams that they need in order to be able to succeed, recognizing that the guy whose highest and best use is in the lab is not necessarily the guy who needs to be driving presentations to investors and running spreadsheets.
Okay, thanks very much. And now Lindsay Brown, who is Strategic Investment Associate from Echo Health Ventures.
Hi, everyone. I'm glad to be here. I'm Lindsay Brown. I'm an investor at Echo Health Ventures. Echo is a strategic investment firm, and we're investing on behalf of 3 alliance members. Those are Cambia Health Solutions, Blue Cross North Carolina, and Blue Cross Arkansas. So as strategic investors, we're really investing along the strategies of those 3 alliance members, which at the end of the day are focused on transforming the healthcare ecosystem really into one that adds quality, access, lower costs for individuals and their families. We're stage agnostic investors, investing in healthcare IT and tech-enabled services across all stages, seed through growth. Yeah, that's us in a nutshell.
Okay, thanks very much, Lindsay. Now we have Tobin Arthur, who is Executive Chairman and Chief Investment Officer at Angel MD.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here. Just a little bit about Angel MD. We founded it a number of years ago, thinking that the way we invest in private companies is going to become increasingly digital. And so we think of it somewhat as Venture 2.0. And so we have some of our own funds, but we also leverage our platform or enable our platform to be used by other funds. I happen to sit on the partnership level for a couple of our funds that are seed focused. We do have, each fund has its own thesis, its own focus. Our first 2 were focused on seed investments across healthcare. So it includes digital health, therapeutics, medical device. Our sweet spot is generally medical device, although we do a fair amount of therapeutics and digital health. And then we soon will have a growth fund and a venture debt fund to complement those. Also sort of agnostic by sector. And one of the key attributes we look for, and one of our key key components is our large network of physicians. We have thousands of physicians that serve as advisors and evaluators. And so we look for companies where those physicians can be additive to the investments we're making.
Great. Thanks very much, Tobin. And finally, let's meet Latif Jackson, who is the venture principal at Elevate Capital.
Hi, thank you. I'm really glad to be here. So actually, I'm a venture partner, which is a little bit different than I think some of the other panelists, and that's because I'm CTO of Troy Medicare. So I actually have a day job where I work as a payor, I believe it's referred to in medical world. And I also work with Elevate to work on their healthcare portfolio because of my experience with healthcare. And so Elevate is a fund that's focused on diversity and inclusion. That's kind of our core thesis. And we also invest in a certain percentage of our portfolio in healthcare. And that's where I come in as I sort of provide that point of view. It's kind of a quick intro. We do seed and Series A. We pretty much do the full range, but our main focus is really with mentorship including capital. So we combine these two to kind of, that's our goal, is to combine the two to bring founders up and anyway, that's summary.
Okay, all right, thanks very much. Thanks, Latif. Thanks, everybody, and let's get to some of the questions. And remember, we're happy to take questions, though if you want to put some into the Zoom chat, I'll try to work some of those in. I think let's start by talking a bit about how you evaluate potential investments. What's the most important thing you look for when evaluating a potential startup investment? Do you have tips for how startups can stand out, or red flags that turn you off? Maybe we can start with Angela.
Thanks, David. You know, it's interesting, but for us, it really matters what is the journey story? What is the thing that motivated this particular individual or entrepreneur to solve a problem? How do they see it? What perspective do they have? Is whatever brought them to the problem going to sustain them for the many years and hardships it will take to get something to market and to succeed? There are many ups and downs, as people know, to starting companies, and they don't all work out. So a lot of what we're testing is, does this person have an authentic and sustaining reason to want to keep after this, because they're going to need it? A lot of the other things can kind of be solved, right? Do they have the wrong financials? Well, you know, are they open to coaching? We can get them people who can help them with financials. Do they just have a losing business model, meaning that they're trying to do something that costs more than what they can get to pay for it, either from investors or sales or grants, in which case it's never going to work. But, you know, a lot of those are technical problems that can be addressed. At the end of the day, does the founding team have the grit to see it through the natural ups and downs?
And you're saying that if they have an unrealistic kind of financial plan, that's a red flag for you? Is that right? Or is there another red flag?
You know, it actually isn't, given that we will probe with them. It's very common for early stage entrepreneurs to not understand fully financials, and certainly not in the way that an investor wants to see them. Because we are willing to work with such early companies, we also take in many ways a coaching or referral role to help them get into the right type of expertise, as long as they're open to it. If we sense that they're not open to it, then we just don't waste our time. But very often we help them connect with experts, be they legal, consultants, or financial, you know, CFO, not CFO so much, but the controller, bookkeepers. You know, that's part of our job. I imagine most people in the audience today did not think about starting a company in order to do the books. So we help them round out their team if things don't look good on the financial side.
Okay, thank you very much. Stan, you laughed at that. That may sound familiar. I don't know. What do you look for when evaluating teams, and what are the kind of the tips you can offer, the red flags that scare you away?
Well, as a former academician myself, I understand that that the skills involved in being a successful researcher are not necessarily those in running a business, and it's quite frequently that I wind up encountering people that are brilliant at what they do that have absolutely no idea how to run the business, start or run. And that's okay. And in our world, that's not a disqualifier. That's now a failure to be coachable is, and a failure to recognize that a team is important and that the team does not contain I is also, a pretty red flag. So the things that we look for are the drive to succeed. That I'm sure you've created this thing and you've got it to the point that it's passed a laws of physics questions and you've got one setting on your desk. Oh my God, that's so thrilling. How do I turn that into 100 or 100,000 or 100 million? I'm sorry, that's beyond your reach. You can't do that right now, but we can connect you with people that can help you with that if that's what you're willing to do. And the tenacious pursuit of the goal is the thing that we're really looking for. Are you willing to abandon your belief? Are you willing to confront disconfirmatory information with acceptance and openness, and embrace the struggle that's ahead of you? And if that's true, and we like the technology, then we're in. That's a pretty big deal.
When you talk about the importance of tenacity, but also you want people to be coachable, is that often those things at odds with one another? And how do you deal with that?
Well, I apologies in advance to those of you to whom this does not apply, but there are an extraordinarily large percentage of people that bear both MDs and PhDs at the same time that are convinced that they know everything about everything. And that disconfirmatory information and that first blush of how hard could this possibly be with the harsh realities of pretty effing hard is a place where we encounter with some frequency. And I get to speak to that from being on the other side of the table and can help people across that gap sometimes. But the extent to which the reality check on that registers with them winds up being a critical path element on it for them to recognize that, oh yeah, maybe this is actually harder than I thought it was.
And Lindsay, what about you? What do you have similar experience? What do you look for, and how do people stand out? And what are the red flags too?
Yeah, I would just echo everything that's already been said. I think, yes, tenacity, but I think with that also, there's a requirement for humility, especially in healthcare. This is an industry where sales cycles are exceptionally long, 12 to 18 months often. And so one is experience and knowledge that that's probably going to be the case, but then also a humility of this industry, and it just is long and hard. And so, that then speaks to the red flags. Is an entrepreneur saying that they can beat that sales cycle? Maybe, but we haven't seen much of that yet.
Okay. Latif, what about you? What do you look for, and what are the things that scare you off?
What scares us off? I think one of the things that everyone said kind of a lot of similar things. I kind of think of it as a growth mindset, because especially in healthcare, in my experience, it is very, very hard. I think Haven, was a recent failure that happened, and that was a combination between Amazon and JP Morgan, and they had all the money in the world. And so it's not just, you can have a lot of things. They had a lot of PhDs and they had a lot of knowledge, and it still didn't work. And to me, if you look at the successful entrepreneurs, and this is a life that you're committing to. So the passion and the tenacity that was mentioned, those are all key aspects. But I think it is, sort of thinking about what every business that starts off, it's got to change and it's got to grow. And so, does the team have a growth mindset? Are they thinking about, okay, we don't have this now, but we don't have it yet. So how are we going to work around it? How are we going to solve this problem? And so that's the way I look for teams, and not just individuals, but complete teams that have a growth mindset.
Can you talk a little bit about coachability? I mean, how do you approach that? That's critical to you as well, I guess.
Yeah, and specifically because we focus on underserved founders, and so they traditionally don't have a network. They don't necessarily come from Ivy League schools with already a network of people that is willing to coach them and be part of them. So we really see a role as bringing that. So we tap into our own network, extensive network in Elevate to find other people that are in the industry or that they can connect with to help them grow and coach them into what needs to be successful for their business.
Okay, thanks. Neela, can you talk the same question to you? What turns you on as an investor and what turns you off?
Sure. I think the number one thing you look for in biotech in general is that the problem that is being solved is that the most important problem. And really, in simplistic terms, you're trying to solve really challenging unmet clinical needs with science that is incredibly unpredictable and complicated. And so what you want is to manage all of those risks that can be managed and just leave it to the gods of the science to determine whether that works out or not. And within that, I guess, is what can be managed. And if you're solving a really critical problem that is of significant magnitude, then you don't need to worry about the nuances of the market or the commercial appeal. Things will sort it out if you're solving an important enough problem. Likewise, you want the best management in place. You want a team because A people bring on more A people on board. And so management risk or operational risk is the last thing you want as well. And so that leaves you with just the scientific risk to execute. And that pretty much is how it translates to red flags, I suppose. From a scientific team angle, you want to avoid people that tend to massage the science or the data for their own benefits. And that occasionally happens, and it's unfortunate, but it does happen. And so you try to look for validation of the science in other labs than the ones being considered, or an external CRO where it may be replicated. And in terms of management, you want to look at their past history. It's okay to fail in science and in the clinic, but how they handle that and how they've handled that in the past is a very strong indicator of how they're likely to handle failure in something you back them on.
You mentioned the importance of having an A team, and Stan was talking about how plenty of MD PhDs know less than they think they do. What's an A team for you? Are there certain things, credentials that you look for that impress you?
I mean, I might be biased there with my own academic background, so limited in how I can touch on that. No, I mean, I agree. There's a couple of ways you look at it. If you're on the investment side, the MD PhDs can often provide a level of granularity and closer to the grassroots level of how a science actually plays out and will that work. At the same time, if you're actually eventually looking to make that investment decision, you need a very different mindset. If you're too focused on finding and evaluating all the reasons why something might fail, you're not probably cut out to be a venture investor in an early stage. There's a tremendous amount of risk that you should be willing to take, but it should be very much an educated risk. And so oftentimes when you're an MD PhD, you sort of have this tunnel vision on finding that golden thing that checks all of the boxes, which doesn't quite exist. And so that's important, and I do understand that point. From a management standpoint, again, I guess it matters less so. You want people that deeply understand the science, but also can understand the business side. And from our experience in the therapeutic side, it's easier to find MD PhDs that understand business than educate business folks on granularities of science and clinical and regulatory processes. So it often works out best on that side.
Great. Okay, thank you. And Tobin, what about you? What same question to you?
There's been some great comments, and I think they touch on a lot of what we think about. So just to simplify it, and this depends, by the way, based on the stage. So we're looking for different things at different stages, and also whether it's digital health versus device and therapeutics. They're different businesses in many ways, but it really comes down to, for us, idea, team, and timing. An idea, we're looking for things that are beyond just incremental advances. They need to be potentially significant shifts. Team, we've had some good comments on team, and we absolutely agree on coachability. We study, there's an economist at NYU, and she's done a lot of publishing around characteristics of startups and are there patterns to these. And she identified that the #1 characteristic were coachable entrepreneurs. And there's some other funny characteristics that have come out of that as well. Certain schools actually have very low scores because they tend to think they've got it all figured out. But the one thing I guess that hasn't necessarily been mentioned that I'll add to the commentary, and that is, and years ago, an iconic venture capitalist who's now retired, I asked him, are there any characteristics to companies that have succeeded and or failed over your career? And he didn't bat an eye. He said, that's easy. The #1 thing is they've got to be able to sell. And he said, we're going to fail once in a while clinically, but that's a given. We accept failing clinically. We're just generally not going to figure that out up front. But he says more often than not, the companies that either failed or succeeded, it was because they brought in somebody who could sell. And that's whether that's raising capital, selling products, selling the company. And he said, typically the DNA of a clinical or a technical founder is that they're not salespeople. And he said, so some of their very best investments were people that were very self-aware and brought in somebody to complement them, whatever role. And every company has different, that could be slotting somebody in the CEO role, and the clinical founder takes on chief technology or chief medical officer role. All of that sort of immaterial in the end, but it's really about having the yin and the yang, somebody who can build technical product and somebody who can sell that product, because there is no such thing as build it and they will come, generally speaking.
Are there specific, is there a certain number of people you look for on a team or who have complementary backgrounds and skills? And is there an ideal number for a team?
Not necessarily. I guess that would again be very stage dependent. So typically at the seed stage, we're dealing with much smaller teams. It may just be a couple of or a handful of people, and later it's deeper. And typically in the later stage companies, we're looking for people that have extensive backgrounds in that particular industry. In other words, they're specialists. Whereas in the early stage, you're generally banking on the entrepreneur. We also have looked at the math behind, quote, sort of repeat entrepreneurs. And there's no mathematical correlation to previous successes and future successes. That's something that gets tossed around in the industry, and it just doesn't bear out.
So I want to move on to a question to talk about from the other perspective for how startups can evaluate their investor. But is there anything else that anyone wants to say at this point that wasn't mentioned about what you're looking for in startups to invest in? Yeah, Angela.
Can I add a quick note about coachability, because I don't want anyone on the call to leave that if they just nod their head every time they meet with an investor, that they're going to succeed. I think that if you look at the Mark Zuckerbergs and other famous entrepreneurs, most would describe them as terribly uncoachable. Right. And so, but the rest of us probably aren't them, and they have a lot of issues that they've had to overcome with the help of a lot of interventions and team members. But what I like is an entrepreneur who listens to everything, doesn't have to agree with me on anything. I love it when they say, you know what, I'm going to think about this. Even if they come back and say, I thought about this. I see where you're coming from. I respectfully do not agree. And here's why. And to me, that is still coachable, right? They listened and they acted. They don't always have to agree. So just want to throw that out there so we don't confuse people about coachability.
Hey, David, can I add one more thing to that?
Yeah, please.
I think that's this is a very good vein, and you don't often hear this from investors, this topic of coachability. And I agree with Angela. The other term we use for that is we look for people that are intellectually curious. They're lifelong learners, and that is to say they want to learn every day. So they come at the problem. We like conviction, and to Angela's point, we don't want people that are wishy-washy. They've got to have some conviction, but they've also got to be humble enough to know a startup is essentially running a series of experiments. And so we want people that aggressively are running those experiments. They understand what they're looking for, what does success look like, and they're willing to iterate and pivot as those experiments, if they're being honest about them, if they're not necessarily working, figuring out how to shift and pivot on those.
Well, this is a bit early, but I'm sorry, Stan, or did Lindsay, someone else want to say something?
To Tobin's point, people that have that degree of intellectual curiosity, there tend to be a high concentration of them in the sciences. So that's that's a good thing.
Did you raise your hand or did I miss something? Okay. Well, it's a bit premature, but there's a question that's come in for Tobin. Could you speak a bit more on what you're saying about first-time versus repeat founders?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that get thrown around in industries, and they kind of become taken for face value. And so one of the things you'll often hear or people look at is, what kind of success have you had a successful quote exit? And the reality is, I'll give you an example. There's a famous cardiovascular surgeon at Stanford who has built 6 extremely successful companies. He was getting ready to retire several years back, and his 7th company was actually his biggest failure. And he and I were sitting around having a conversation. He said, if that commentary that previous success has some indication of future success, this 7th company would have been my greatest success. And in fact, just as I get ready to retire, it's my greatest failure. And he said, I think that the characteristic of luck gets significantly undervalued or underestimated in the role of building startups.
Interesting.
Now, there are those unicorns, don't get me wrong. There are some people who everything they touch seems to turn to gold, but sort of like the Mark Zuckerberg comment, those get sort of touted and I think somewhat played up in the blogs and so forth as the standard. You don't read about the 1,000 people that just doesn't apply to.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on and again, taking the other perspective. So for people who are, how can a startup evaluate a potential investor? What are the good qualities they should look for, and what should they watch out for? And how choosy should early stage startup be? Lindsay, you want to take that one?
Yeah, one of the things that I think is important is, one, the diversity of the investment firm. But then also, as a startup is evaluating investors, which are not hard to come by in this market. And so I think one is how do they treat the junior staff, the ones sort of doing the diligence in this process? Because I think that's telling at the board level. Once an investor joins your board, how well do they work with you and collaborate with you and your team? So I think that's one thing to look out for. The other, I'll speak again on sort of expertise in healthcare, specifically. I think it's important to get folks who are experienced in this industry and sector, who can make those introductions into their networks and help you facilitate your sales cycles and everything else that goes along with that.
Is there a red flag for the startup people looking at investors, potential investors? What should make them run away and go look for funding elsewhere?
I think it goes back to that comment of sort of watching how lead investment partners sort of treat their staff and their teams, and the teams below the management team within a startup. I think venture capital is not lacking in ego. And so to the extent that you can find investors who have that approachability and humility, I think is critical.
Thanks. Latif, what about from your perspective? What should startups look for in investors?
Yeah, I think I think a lot of it is the research of what's their portfolio. Can you talk to other companies that they funded, and that's really going to tell you a lot about what the experience would be with that firm. And that's where I would look. What are their check sizes? What does it say on Crunchbase or PitchBook? I think the research is really key because it is sort of it's in some ways a marriage. So you kind of it's going to be a long-term relationship. So you really want to do your research on what does this look like? And I think even do they look like good investors for your Series B or C or whatever in the future? So it's not just for now, but it's also additionally as time goes on. And then are there people who are partners or part of the firm that would be really good people to have on your board? And I think Lindsay sort of mentioned that, but I definitely think that's good to know before, if you can, the more research you can, because I think that also work both ways as far as fit.
So it sounds like the team is important from the startup's perspective as well. Finding someone who's got a good team of people. Anything else to say about that? About what specific team members they should look for?
I mean, I think, I think the better fit, I think, is more, what are your core values as a company? Is it transparency? Is it growth? Is it, curiosity? I think Tobin mentioned that. What are the kind of things that you value, and is there a match with the fund?
Okay, Neela, what about you? What advice would you have for startups looking to choose a investment firm?
Yeah, I mean, I could speak to the ones on the biopharma side. These are incredibly long journeys, very difficult, easily more than a decade or so. And so you want to look for partners that are in it for the long haul, who have been in it previously and have put products into the clinic and supported companies all the way through ups and downs and market cycles and whatnot. And so it's very much the same rigorous diligence they would be doing on you as management folks as you're supposed to do on the investor side. You want to understand what their track record looks like. Have they done and backed companies in the past successfully? You want to reach out to the management in those companies and do reference checks on how they've interacted with the management teams, as Lindsay alluded to, but also what input have they had from a strategic syndicate and an exit standpoint, if you will, or a product strategy standpoint. So you want people to roll up their sleeves and actually get in, but at the same time, if you don't want them to micromanage things, right? So you're there to lead the company, and that should be the case. I guess the only thing I'd say as a red flag on the investor side is, at least in our space, you want to avoid the tourists, the bio-tourists, if you will, and so there are folks that run to where the sun is shining, and as soon as the cycle flips, they're the first ones to back out, and you end up with a syndicate where you suddenly don't have someone jumping into the subsequent rounds of funding when you're in desperate need of cash, and biotech's expensive. So you want people with deep pockets, have the long-term vision and understand the risks that come with this industry.
You talk about background and reference checks. Is there some specific advice about how to do that in an efficient way without, does that potentially turn off potential investors or what?
I haven't met anyone in our syndicate group that considers it turn off. In fact, most like to, once you get at that close enough point where you're about to extend a term sheet or you're making a decision on a term sheet, we proactively introduced management teams to CEOs in our other portfolio companies, and they could by themselves, by all means, reach out to other portfolio companies just so that we're not, biasing them towards a select few, if you will. And that kind of holds us accountable to do good by our teams that we bring on board. And certainly the whole idea is if we've done well with each of our stakeholders, then they'll bring the next deal, or with the next technology, we'll be hired. We'll be able to hire this particular management onto the next successful venture. And so you want people to feel good when they work with you and have success, and continue to work with you. It's hard to find good talent. So by all means, if they don't share the details, you should be proactively seeking that and reaching out to other management folks for reference checks.
Thank you. Stan, what else would you add to this discussion?
Well, if I'm doing due diligence on the firm as a founder, the first question I want to ask is, what is the end of your fund life, right? Because that's a huge thing. And I'll tell you right off the bat whether or not this is going to be a good fit. You can estimate how long it's going to take you from where you are until having a product in market, and then from having a product in market to having some measure of success. The investors are looking at when they're going to get their money back, and the key determinant on whether or not you are in scope for them is whether or not they believe you're going to have a liquidity event before their fund goes end of life. So if their fund life is 7 years and you've got a 10-year exit window, that's not going to be a good fit. So that's the first question I lead with on stuff like that, because you want that alignment. and you don't want the hurry up and exit pressure for the guy that's creeping up on end of life. You want people that are in it for an appropriate length of time, and you'll know what that is for you.
Right. Okay. And Tobin, what about you? What should investors or startups look for in an investor?
I think the comments so far have really covered it. It's going to come largely down to personal fit. And so I think taking the time to make sure you've got a good personal relationship with particularly the person that's going to sit in the lead role from the firm is important. And I think Stan's absolutely right. There are some mechanical things that you've got to take into account, like the life cycle of that particular fund.
Okay. And red flags for startups looking at investors.
Yeah, the red flags are fairly, in our experience, are fairly easy to identify because you just look at the experience of the companies in the network. And, we always tell entrepreneurs, our goal is to make them future LPs in our funds. And so, our goal is their success. And I think you get a lot of that in those initial discussions to see, is the investor really on my side? Are they sitting on my side of the table? Are the incentives all properly aligned? And that's critical, is getting those alignment. And I was going to, mention just one resource. Many of you probably know who Brad Feld is, the founder of Techstars. He's based in Boulder, but Brad's written a number of books. And I think one thing for entrepreneurs who are kind of new to the game is to get familiar with terms and not only just terms in terms of words, but legal terms that come up in deal structure, because you're at a real disadvantage in some ways with respect to investors who do this every day. And Brad Feld talks about that as getting some comfort and familiarity so that you're at least having a conversation somewhat as equals when you do sit down and talk about terms, because there's terms that, will go over 95% of entrepreneurs' heads, only to learn a number of years down the road, perhaps, that those terms really put them in a significant disadvantage. Had they realized, what they were doing earlier, they may not have agreed to some of those. So there's just some things to protect yourself and just go into relationships eyes wide open.
Right, that's interesting. So Angela, what about you? What does it mean to have eyes wide open when you're looking for someone to fund your startup?
I highly encourage startups to understand that A, it's a relationship, and B, they have choices. So any research they can do, asking peer organizations if they have familiarity with the investor, all those things are going to go a long way to the selection process. I think the comments so far have been excellent. Lindsay really talking about some of the sort of interpersonal and diversity things around how you make the research and selection, asking some tough questions. I think that I forget the name of the organization, but it's connected to All Raise, which is a group of female venture capitalists. They also have a founder's arm and a coalition of startups that have a pledge around diverse, only taking money from funds that will put a diverse candidate on their board, that kind of thing. So the questions are changing that people are asking, and I think it's fantastic. We have to start pushing the boundary to create the world we're shooting for, not just in whatever problem we're trying to solve. But so that was like big idea. I liked some of the things Stan said around knowing the fund, asking around the fund life. Another trick is to find out whether they're going to raise another fund. So say that, and then find out where they are in their investing period. A typical 10-year fund will invest for the first 5 years and then manage out what's called manage out the investments for the last 5. That's called, harvest mode. They're not going to put any new money in new companies, but guess what? They're still going to see you, meet with you, and take your call. Why? Because they don't want to lose their pipeline. So you could be thinking things are going really well and they're not investing. So those are very legit questions to ask. Where are you in your funding with this fund? Are you going to raise another fund? What is the timing of that? When do you have a first close with that fund that you could see making an investment out of that new fund? Those aren't aggressive questions. Those are just good, solid, sophisticated questions.
Great, thank you. Stan, you're nodding. Do you want to say anything else about that?
Yeah, that gets into that understanding. I think Tobin was mentioning that you need to understand how the system works, and I think it's critically important for founders to understand how venture capitalists actually make money, how they actually get paid off of the investments that they're doing. Because if you go in, excuse me, understanding that process, the questions that you can ask about how they see you and how you can work with them change. Understanding the dynamics that Angela was talking about are critical if you're trying to make a good choice. And she's perfectly right about that. There are plenty of funds where they really like you and they really want to invest, and they can't really because they're either at their bag limit for the number of new checks that they can write out of their current fund, or they're in the harvest phase and aren't writing new checks, and the new fund isn't quite ready yet. But boy, howdy, call us back in X window of time, which is potentially a good thing, but we're kind of looking for a check, maybe later this week instead of sometime in the third quarter of next year.
Okay, and now let's talk a little bit about how the world really works. What are some common misconceptions about venture or angel funding? What's the truth that needs to be better known? Lindsay, is that something you want to talk about?
Yeah, sure. I think the thing that comes up for me on this one is that all venture investors are created equally. Going back to what Nile said about sort of the tourism aspect in healthcare and life sciences, especially, the market is crazy right now, particularly in healthcare. And so a lot of people do want to get involved in that. But then that can lead to frustration down the road when, learning that, it takes a lot of money to get something off the ground, or that the sales cycles are long. So that's one.
Okay. Tobin, how about you?
There's a couple of things that we face pretty regularly, one of which is underestimating the timelines to raise capital. It's not uncommon for us to get a call from a company that says, I'm halfway done with my round. Can you help us finish out the round? Or we're trying to wrap it up in the next 3 weeks, that kind of thing. And the reality is these things just have a natural timeline. That doesn't mean sometimes you can't compress them a little bit, but we tell entrepreneurs, start early, start building relationships. Well, there's a great book years ago, Dig Your Well Before You're Thirsty. And it's sort of true here, which is start building relationships long before you're going to be raising capital. The other thing that we would suggest is there's been a culture, I think, created over the last decade or so that once you've got an idea and you're coming out of the lab or coming out of your garage, proverbial garage, it's time to go get venture capital. And there are a lot of sources of capital. And so we really encourage entrepreneurs to realize there's lots of places to raise money. The first answer is typically not venture capital. There are exceptions, of course, but non-dilutive money in the form of grants is fantastic if they're eligible for that, for example. Friends and family can be successful. There's angel groups, 475 of them around the country, and on and on and on. There're just lots and lots of resources. And so the automatic answer isn't to start pitching venture capitalists necessarily. It can be in some cases, but we just think people, again, should have understanding of what are all their options.
Thanks. So you want to have anything else to say about that question, about kind of misconceptions that people have, Latif?
I could, because I feel like I've been on both sides of this fence. You're always fundraising until you're profitable or you've exited. That's probably the most common one. And I think, I'm about to do this for Troy, the company I work for. It's surprising. It feels like time, like, oh, weren't we just fundraising? We're fundraising again. So, but the truth is if you're in a part of a growing company, you probably need capital multiple times. And until, you turn the corner there or get over the hump there and you're profitable, you're going to be always raising capital. And so usually that's one of the things that is most surprising, especially when I'm working earlier in the cycle. I feel like I'm raising money, and I'm like, well, you've only been doing it for a couple months, so of course you're still pitching. So I think getting to kind of accept some of that as a norm is that you're always going to be talking to people about this thing that you're really passionate about, and that's a good thing. So
One different question. You had mentioned, you were one, I think, of 2 or 3 people who mentioned the importance of diversity and inclusion. And I'm wondering what is your firm doing to kind of diversify the pool of founders that you're speaking with?
What are we doing? I think so. I think Fund 1, the first fund, it was pretty early to have the thesis that diversity is sort of part of the DNA of the fund, and that's how we do everything. It's not sort of add-on to us. It's not new, but it definitely it's been validated by our performance. So I think the thing that because we've been doing that for years, we now see a pipeline of that coming in. So that investment we did early on has really paid off, and now we're actually making choices, and there's plenty of diverse founders out there, and it's surprising how just by kind of that investment 5 or 6 years ago that we started with, that's really turned into this huge pool of founders. And I think it's partly networking, but it's partly just being out there over time. It's partly connecting with individuals who are part of communities that are of color or in different networks. And I think that's kind of what we've done, and it's been successful. So that's how I got involved actually just a few years ago. So I think that's the kind of change that we hopefully will see throughout the industry, because I think that's what we need to see, is really in a commitment from the ground up from all parts of the funds. But I think it's been good for us because we've gotten access to really a different diverse group of people, of investors, and now we have kind of those companies who are going to replace us as being, the venture partners. I think someone else had mentioned on the panel that's the next group of venture partners, the next group of LPs are going to be the diverse group of people, and so we've started to see that happen. So that's how we do it.
Thank you. And Tobin, you're nodding too. Did you want to add something to that about what's your experience with increased diversity and inclusion with your firm?
One thing we find, and this is how I think healthcare and life sciences differentiates from tech a little bit. The tech industry, I think, struggles with this issue a bit more, perhaps simply because of if you just look at computer science degree programs, they're they're very heavily leaning towards white males. Life science, on the other hand, first of all, we look for the best candidates. We look for the best companies. It happens that there is a great diversity really built into the network, and we don't really have to, do much more than open our eyes. We've been fortunate that about half of our entrepreneurs happen to be women, and there's a lot of diversity within, the broader ranks. So I do feel fortunate that healthcare and life sciences doesn't mean, we're done and we're not always looking, but I think there's a stark contrast to the tech industry, which I think struggles with this quite a bit more.
Thanks. Angela, what about you and Portland Seed Fund with the goal to get increased diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, I think honestly, our model gives us a lot of freedom to have started on that path, much like Elevate did a while ago. The difference being that we didn't state it in our investing thesis, but as a management team, we internally felt strongly that there was opportunity there. This is probably going back even 8 years ago, where if you look at like the applicant breakdown 10 years ago versus 8 years ago, 6 years ago, something started to turn there. And, the tipping point was probably maybe 5 years ago. We started to see a lot more women entrepreneurs applying with conviction and chops to get it done, right? In the early part of our portfolio, there were attempts, but the women it just so happened that the women entrepreneurs in our portfolio, and if you think about why, every time you're the only person in a room, you look out and you don't see anyone who resembles you. This is the same problem, I think, with founders of color, right? That is starting to be addressed. Still, we have a long way to go. But anytime you can even start to make one investment, and that gives another company or entrepreneur hope that, hey, there's someone out there like me doing this, I can do this. And then creating community around that, a plurality, Doesn't even have to be a majority, but I think anytime you walk into a room and you're now 3 of 10 of you or 4 of 10, it feels different, and the conversation is different. The quality is different of the interaction. And I think that absolutely applies to teams, founding teams. And so we chose to approach it by not making it part of our investment thesis to reach any particular diversity goals, but to quietly, put more options on the table for people to see, founders and investors too that look like them. So Portland Seed Fund is a woman-owned venture fund. It started out me and Jim Houston, and then we brought in another female partner, and then we've added an analyst who is a person of color and a woman who has now started her own fund called Black Founders Matter. And so again, I think it's not just about the entrepreneurs, but we also have to think about changing the face of the investor landscape. So that's kind of been the approach we've taken.
Okay, thank you. I want to work in a question from the audience. I'm not sure who this is for, so if someone wants to raise a hand, that'd be much appreciated. What do you think about the prospects for digital therapeutic startups, the things that are, particularly when apps are targeted to actually treat conditions? Is this a promising new area or too unproven? Does anyone want to talk about that? Oh, okay. All right. Well, let's
a little bit.
go ahead, Toby.
There's a lot. The question's a little bit loaded, so I'll try to narrow it down just in scope a bit. And this is a commentary really around digital health. So if we look at the span of healthcare investments, one of the challenges with digital health is the signal to noise problem, which is to say it's easier to start software companies than it is anything else in terms of devices, drugs, diagnostics, much more difficult. And so you get a lot more folks jumping into digital health, and moreover, you get a lot of folks that don't come from the healthcare industry. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but people coming in from the healthcare industry, a lot of times coming from, say, the tech world, don't have an appreciation for all of the complexities regulatory-wise and timeline-wise that healthcare entails. It's just different. It moves slower. A couple of people have commented to that. It is typically 10 to 15 years behind the tech industry. And so these are realizations that if you're building kind of try to come specifically back to complementary or alternative medicine-based apps, this goes back to a little bit of is this incremental or is there something substantive? When you're taking somebody's outside capital, there's the Angel Capital Association a number of years ago put out an interesting number, which is if you're, as an investor looking at across a portfolio, you need to understand that a given investment has an opportunity to have at least a 35x return in order to work across the balance of the portfolio. Now, forget the specific number of 35x, we could debate that, but the point of it is, if you're asking the entrepreneur, what's the potential exit for your business, or what's the addressable market for this, and how much money do you think you need to raise to get there? If the answer is, I think we need to raise around $5 million, and we think there's a market to sell this for $50 million. That's not a business that a venture firm can make work in a portfolio. That math does not work. And so it's really important for the entrepreneur to work backwards from the investor's perspective. It doesn't mean that that's necessarily a bad business, but it means it's probably going to have to get funded in a different way. And they're going to have to think about that in different ways. And so I don't want to specifically harp on complementary alternative, because again, there's a big swath of things there. But just in general, as an entrepreneur, you need to think that way in terms of the math for the investor.
Latif, did you want to add to that? We can move on.
Go ahead, Lindsay. It sounded like you had something to say. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I missed that.
No. I was just going to say the other thing that we're seeing, particularly with digital therapeutics, is yes, it's still extremely early. Yes, it's super exciting, some of the creations that are coming out right now. The ones that are going to have near-term success, I think, are going to be closely affiliated with specific diseases or conditions that have a clear ROI. for whoever your customer is. So those that accompany, you know, a really expensive drug, for example, those that sort of engage people and show them how to use a drug. We've seen some really interesting companies out of that space. I think the clear winners in the near term are going to be the ones that have very clear studies that they've done that demonstrate ROI for the customers and outcomes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I did have something to say, but I think I was just going to tag on to what Lindsay said. I think that there is a lot of this. It's very popular right now. So just standing out is going to be critical. And so just to tag on that, everything that Tobin and Lindsay said, but also that there is a lot of, so just do your research on what else is currently out there to make sure that you stand out in some way.
Okay. Thanks very much. We got about 15 minutes left, and I want to give everybody an opportunity to brag a little bit and talk about what some success stories that they've had. You know, one that, you know, a company that's gone on to become, can you think of a company that you've worked with that's gone on to become highly successful, and what can the audience learn from that? So that's a long, big question, but I wonder if we could talk about that. Everyone, you know, take a minute or so to answer that question. Nile, do you want to start off with about that? What's a great success story you'd like to brag about?
Well, mine's hopefully still in the pipeline, so nothing much to me personally, but I could speak to Arch in general. In the biotherapeutic space, we've had a number of big successes, all the way from the creation of Alnylam in 2003 or so, with its first FDA-approved product, in a world first in RNA-based therapy in 2017. From then to now, with several other in the pipeline with Receptos, Denali, Grail, and Juno Therapeutics, which had its therapy approved last year on CAR T. And on the R&D tools and instrumentation side, Arch actually created a company called Illumina, which went on to become Illumina, the behemoth that it is, about 58 billion market cap or so, and 90% plus market share in DNA sequencing, and the company that is single-handedly responsible for bringing the cost of DNA sequencing down to $1,000 or sub $1,000. So yeah, all credit to the folks that have founded Arch and founded the companies within Arch that have done tremendous success. I'm just there pouring coffee, so hopefully I'll add to that in the next two decades or so.
Okay, thank you. Stan, you want to talk about something? What's Adventuring's proudest moment?
Well, we're still fairly early stage, but we've managed to partner with a couple of great companies that are moving things forward. And one's a cognitive decline diagnostic that seems to be able to tell significantly earlier than the normal diagnostic criteria that you're at severe risk for cognitive decline event. And we're putting a lot of effort into that, because will have a huge impact. If you can't diagnose something like Alzheimer's until it is fully upon you, then your ability to prepare for it's pretty limited. But if you can get even 3, 4, 5 year advance notice on that, then your ability to have a materially different outcome for your family and yourself is high. And we're hoping that we can get some additional research underway to maybe extend that a little bit further.
Thank you. Angela, I understand you have a story to tell here too.
We have a recent big number win, which is, look, there's a reason we're talking about it. It doesn't happen every day. So even though investors are out there telling entrepreneurs, we can't even look at this if we're not going to see a 10x in 2 seconds. The reality is that is just not how deals go down. So I'm going to tell you a story about luck and relationships. So back in 2014, a company from Seattle named Auth0 was founded, and it just so happened that my partner and I both knew one of the founders, but in different ways. Coincidentally, we were trying to sell one of our portfolio companies to a company we thought he and his past role at Microsoft might be interested in. And he said, sorry, I can't do it. He told Jim, you know, I'm doing my own company and here it is. And so we brought him in. I knew him from Zapproved, another local company, a phenomenal founder, Monica Enand, who I was an early advisor to. And so it was that relationship that we moved quickly on this deal. We only could get $50,000 in on a safe, which back then, those of you who, we won't go through investor term alphabet soup, but even today, there's a lot of firms who will not do a safe, which is kind of a radical convertible note. We'll leave it at that. But back then, I can almost guarantee we were the first and only people who would do a safe. So then we woke up last week to the news that the company sold for $6.5 billion to a public company named Okta. Why I say this is a story of luck and timing. You know, I could lie to you and say we actually did something to help the outcome of the company, but we literally, luckily, and because of relationship, got in the deal. And that'll be the best investment across 140, I fully imagine. Although I challenge the rest of them to keep trying to beat that one, so.
Okay, Latif, thanks very much, Andrew. That's great. Latif, do you want to try to beat that one?
I don't know if I can beat that one. That one is a pretty good, serendipity is, I guess, important. But I would say that I definitely believe being in the right place at the right time is just about showing up. So just showing up is important. I think there's a lot of opportunity as a CTO of a health insurance company. Every day I wish there was something to solve my problems. But I think what I'm excited about for Elevate is we've invested in 2 companies that I think are really exciting. One is called Forest Devices, and they're they're a device company, and I was super excited because I got to read some papers about how they're using machine learning to analyze potential strokes. And so that was super exciting. I think I'm super excited about them. And also one that's a little bit closer to home, which is a company called Time Study. And what's amazing to me sometimes in healthcare space is that there's some really simple problems, just measuring time, that have huge impacts on both costs and have huge benefits for society. And I think that what I'm really excited about Time Study is I think they're going to have a huge impact, not just for, on the cost side, but also, benefiting by having doctors spending more time with patients instead of, documenting their time. So those are 2 that I can talk about and I'm excited about, but no big exits yet.
Okay, thanks very much. Lindsay, what about you? What do you want to brag about? What been your great story from your experience?
Yeah, so Echo Health Ventures is still a fairly new fund or firm, 4 years old. We did have a few notable exits in the last few years, so that was super exciting. I think one of the success stories that I'd like to bring up is being a strategic investor. So, we're investing along the strategies of our alliance partners. Part of that is getting a really deep understanding of what those specific strategies are and where we can find innovative solutions to plug into. One of those is around behavioral health and addiction treatment. So me and a colleague spent quite a bit of time assessing the addiction treatment market. It's traditionally a pretty depressing sector where, not really having the patient interest at heart, revolving door models in Malibu and Florida. And so we started thinking about models that are holistic in approach and outcomes based. And at the same time, one of our alliance members was redefining their addiction treatment strategy. So it worked out from a timing perspective that we found a great company, a PowerPoint deck at that time, and we're able to do the seed investment and then also support Blue Cross North Carolina in building out an anchor partnership with this company. It's called Eleanor Health, based in North Carolina and Boston. So still an early stage company, but really exciting to be able to plug that into one of our alliance partners and help support that strategy.
Okay, thanks very much. We're going to run out of time in a few minutes. We've got about 5 minutes left. And I just want to remind everyone in the audience that if you join for the networking event and spatial chat later, you'll have a chance to ask your own questions additionally, because there are plenty of questions that are coming that we don't have time to do here. But I just wanted to give Tobin a chance, if you do quickly, a story that you want to tell about what's going on at Angel MD.
Sure, I'll just mention real quick a DNA of a company called Invent-a-thon. It sort of represents what we love about certain companies. And this is out of our first fund, which is just over 3 years old. This is a young engineering team. They are working to get rid of cords in the operating room. And so they're using military grade wireless technology. We brought in surgeons as the primary investors. We put together a syndicate to invest alongside our fund. And so now they have 25 of the leading orthopedic surgeons in the country that are backing that country. But more importantly than their money, they're leveraging the product, they're beta testing that product. And as a result, several of the large orthopedics companies that everybody would recognize are now looking to acquire that company in under 36 months because of the traction they've been able to achieve.
Great. Just one last question, and I won't have time for everyone, but if anyone wants to answer this, please do. And that has to do with the pandemic. I'm wondering, how has the pandemic affected how you source and select life science investments? Is it the same, only everything's done by Zoom, or are there bigger differences? Anyone want to weigh in on that? Oh.
In our case, I'll just jump in real quick. You know, it's much of the same, but there's a lot more volume. There's a heightened interest in healthcare. We actually see a lot of volume on the LP side, family offices, sovereign funds wanting to get more capital deployed into healthcare, which is fantastic. On the deal flow side, certainly a lot more remote, and we think that's probably somewhat permanent because we found we can just be so much more efficient. You know, forget the protocols around the pandemic itself. It's just more efficient working remotely. Now, it doesn't completely replace in person, but it's worked out very well so far.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're going to run out of time, but there's one question that maybe we can address individually, and that is this. I thought it was a kind of interesting question. Is there an idea or a general area of healthcare that you're dying to hear a good pitch for, but nobody seems to have nailed it yet? That's something that maybe we'll tease people to join the spatial chat group, which I think you should be able to see in your chat there, the URL to join that. You know, this has been a great conversation. Thanks, everybody. Also, and I hope that you'll, you know, in the chat, maybe in the spatial chat, and I think also this will be shared with the audience members, books, podcasts, social feeds, whatever that entrepreneurs can turn to better understand the process and stay on top of trends. So as you go into the spatial chat, and thanks for doing that, please think about that. And if you're in the audience, look for that an email that gives you some other resources. We'll make sure to circulate these. So that's all the time that we have. I guess we have one more minute. Just want to thank everybody for a really interesting conversation. I enjoyed it anyway. It was really very much appreciated. And I'm hoping that everybody will join me and the panelists in the networking space on spatial chat. We'll get going in about 5 minutes. And I wanted to say, in addition to thanking the panelists and the audience as well, a special thank you to the OHSU Invent-a-thon, Oregon Bioscience Association, and Oregon Clinical and Translational Research Institute for hosting this event. Also to let you know, you'll receive a follow-up email, which will include a link to register for the Invent-a-thon post-hack on April 21. I hope to see you there. So, wow, right on time. Thanks very much, and see you shortly in the spatial chat. Bye-bye.
Great moderating, David. Thank you.
Great to talk to you.
Thanks, David.
Thank you, David.
Everyone, see you over in spatial chat.